Okay, so today we're going to continue with our talk about how nerves send information to the muscles. So we're going to learn about action potentials. So you should have learned about a resting membrane potential. So once the neuron has basically set up the battery, we want to discover how this neuron generates the signal or the action potential and then sends it down the axon or the long end of the neuron to the muscle. So membrane potentials can actually act as signals or action potentials. So when your membrane potential changes, there's several ways membrane potential can change. We're talking about the plus minus on the inside outside of the cell. That can change when the concentration of the ions change across the membrane, or so physically you have more sodium or more potassium inside or outside the cell, or the permeability of the membrane actually changes. And so we're really going to talk about this change in permeability when we talk about an action potential. We're going to talk about how the membrane actually becomes more permeable to sodium and potassium, allowing more sodium and potassium to move across that membrane. Well, if you think about those sodium and potassiums having a charge, they each are pluses, they have positive charge. As those pluses can move across the membrane, that would change the membrane potential. So these changes in membrane potential are the signals that we use to communicate, our nervous system uses to communicate throughout our body, and we call those signals action potentials. So the action potential is simply the neuron's way of conducting electrical signals, okay? And these action potentials are generated through the flow of positively charged ions across the neuronal membrane, so sodium and potassium. Okay, and we're going to talk about which way they go in or out, or how they move. But we're going to talk about the sodium and potassium in particular flowing through this membrane. And when these ions change or move across the membrane, they use something called voltage-gated channels. So when we talked about resting membrane potential, we talked about leak channels, which are basically proteins that open up or stay open all the time, and sodium and potassium can move across them down their concentration gradient. A voltage-gated channel is a protein that only opens when there's a voltage change. So you could almost imagine an actual gate that if you had a remote control that you could zap it with, that would open the gate. And so when the gate opens, the protein opens, sodium and potassium are allowed to move across the membrane. So instead of a leak channel, you have a voltage-gated channel. Now in the neuron, only the axon is capable of producing the action potential. We don't see it in the dendrites and the cell body. When we talk about these membrane channels, just as a review, there are two types of proteins, two types of membrane channels made up of proteins. You have leakage channels, which they're non-gated. That means they're always open, that allow ions to move down their concentration gradient. Passive transport. Well, also using passive transport, where things move down their concentration gradient, we have things that are called gated channels. That means that they're closed and something has to happen to cause them to open. So you have ligand-gated and voltage-gated. Ligand-gated means something has to physically attach to the gate to open it. Okay, so in the case of a muscle gated channel, ligand-gated channel is a neurotransmitter. In the neuron, we have voltage-gated channels, which means a slight change in voltage will open or close those gates. Okay, so I'll show you a little more information about that on the next slide. So what that kind of looks like, these gated channels, this will be a ligand gated channel. So you can see there's a receptor, something physically, a neurotransmitter has to physically bind to that site that opens up the channel and allows things to flow back and forth, okay? If it's a voltage gated channel, you can see here's your positives and here's your negatives. Well, if something causes a change in the potential, there's a change in the voltage. So here we've reversed our charges, so now the positive is inside, the negative is outside. That change opens up the channel and allows the ions to flow. So you have ligand gated and voltage gated. Now, they are similar into leak channels in that once they are open, the ions do flow down their concentration gradient. Okay, so in this one, sodium is higher on the outside than it is on the inside. So once the channel opens, sodium will go in that direction. It's going to flow into the cell, which is different because this is passive transport. So this will be different than active transport. That sodium-potassium pump we talked about earlier, where you pump an ion against its gradient, that's not what's happening. You're just simply opening up the gate so that the ions can flow down their concentration gradient. Okay. This may take a little while. This is some complex physiology, so don't beat yourself up if you're just kind of confused right now. It'll take a while. So the big thing we want to talk about the action potential. So I've got a slide here to kind of set up the big picture and show you what we're going to be talking about. And this is a graph. So remember I told you when we talked about membrane potential, you can put a voltmeter in a cell, and you literally can do this. You can stick a voltage meter inside a cell and measure the voltage and graph it out and show how the voltage inside the cell changes. So that's what this is. This is just a graph over time of the changes in the charge across the membrane. So if you remember, at rest, when you have your membrane potential in a neuron, it's minus 70 millivolts. Well, this is what an action potential looks like. It's just this, this spike. And the upward deflection, this is called depolarization. And we'll talk about what's happening, what channels are happening, what ions are flowing that cause this membrane to become depolarized. That means it's becoming less polar. It's becoming, the inside's becoming, the inside's becoming more positive relative to what it was. So remember, if you looked at the cell before, and it was negative on the inside and positive on the outside. As it depolarizes, the inside of the cell becomes more and more positive. It finally reaches kind of a peak of inside positive, and at that point, some channels close, and we're going to talk about which channels do what. Some channels, some open and some closed, and then the membrane potential repolarizes. That means it starts to become more negative again. Okay, so it's going to be repolarized. And then it takes kind of a downward turn where it kind of goes over, it overshoots and becomes really super negative. And we call that hyperpolarization. And all of these have to do with opening and closing of either a sodium or potassium channel. So we're going to take these step by step and talk about which ions are moving and when they move, what's happening. Okay, so remember, I've done this myself when I was in graduate school. You put a voltage meter inside of a cell, you can actually watch this change in voltage. So again, this action potential is all about the relative permeability to sodium and potassium. Okay, so we're still going to go through and talk about what's happening at each step. But at rest, we've already talked about what's going on there. We have that 75 leak channels of potassium and 1 of sodium. Well, something changes during depolarization. And what changes is sodium becomes more permeable. And I'm going to talk to you about, and let's think about it. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to think if you can figure it out. Which way is sodium going? Is sodium going into the cell or out of the cell? All we know right now is sodium permeability is changing. But I want you to think about if you can figure out where is sodium going. Is it rushing into the cell or is it rushing out? Let you think. During the repolarization phase, there is an increased permeability in potassium. So something's happening with potassium. It's either going into the cell or out of the cell. So I'm just going to give you just a second to see if you can figure it out before we move on. So if you're thinking about a cell, and if there's more sodium on the outside and there's more potassium on the inside, if permeability changes, if you increase the permeability, think about which way these ions are going to flow. Will sodium go in or will sodium go out? Got it? No? Let's move on. Okay, so remember, at rest, you only have those leak channels, right? So you've got more potassium, here's my cell, more potassium is leaving than sodium is coming in, right? So more positives are leaving than positives are entering. So you have a negative membrane potential, negative on the inside compared to the outside. So all your gated channels are closed. Only the leak channels are open at this point. This is setting up the battery. So this is review. Now what happens? Okay, so the next step is depolarization. During depolarization, there's a depolarizing current, a signal that tells the neuron that it needs to generate a signal, and this current will open the voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, so these are gated channels. Now something has zapped them like a remote control and caused them to open. Well, think about your cell. And now if you've opened up another channel, you've opened up the gate, and there's more sodium outside than inside, which way does sodium go? It rushes in, bringing with it lots and lots of positives. So it's going to cause the inside of the membrane to become more and more positive. It's going to depolarize the membrane. Okay? Let's go to the next step. Now, once you've had your resting membrane potential, you've depolarized. When you get to about positive 30, those sodium channels will close. They're like, okay, we've done enough. They actually close at that voltage. They will literally close back at positive 30. And so your membrane permeability to sodium starts to go down. So no more sodium starts to come in. It stops coming in. And your voltage sensitive potassium channels open. Okay, so at repolarization, when your membrane potential starts to go back toward negative, in this third step of repolarization, potassium is exiting the cell. So let's draw that out again. So here's my cell. Okay, so we've had lots of sodium coming in, causing the membrane to become more and more positive. Once it becomes positive to plus 30 millivolts, these channels close, no more sodium comes in, and some new channels, voltage-gated potassium channels, they open, and now potassium starts to rush out of the cell. And that will take positive charges with it and bring the membrane potential back down to negative, or repolarize it. So the fourth step is hyperpolarization. So hyper means it's becoming too polarized, it's becoming too negative. And hyperpolarization occurs when some of the potassium channels stay open too long and too much potassium is allowed to leave. So it's taking too many positive charges out of the cell, leaving the inside of the cell too negative. So we draw that out for action potential depolarization, repolarization. It undershoots and then it'll come back up. So this would be the hyperpolarization. It's also called the refractory period because at this point you can't cause the cell to generate another action potential. It kind of stops it and gives the cell just kind of a little micro break before you can generate another action potential. So this is the hyperpolarization due to some potassium channels staying open a little bit too long and allowing a little extra potassium to leave, and the inside of the cell becomes more negative. All right, so when we have our action potential and we do our depolarization, repolarization, and hyperpolarization, something has to basically reset the battery and bring us back to rest and get us to where we were before so that we have a lot of potassium inside the cell and not so much sodium inside the cell. And that's the job of the sodium-potassium pump. So the sodium-potassium pump redistributes the ions, sodium and potassium, back to the resting conditions. And remember, this is something that requires ATP. So this is active transport, where you're pumping sodium and potassium against their concentration gradients. So this resets the battery so that you're able to have another action potential. Now, there's one more thing about action potentials. There's something, action potentials are all or none. They either happen or they don't. So remember when I told you something has to cause a voltage change to open up those voltage-gated sodium channels? If it's just a little bit of something changing, we call that a stimulus. If it's a sub-threshold stimulus, that means it's so weak, it's a weak depolarization, it's not enough to cause those sodium channels to open and nothing happens. You have to have what's called a threshold stimulus. It's got to be a strong enough push, a strong enough change in the membrane potential to change to cause those sodium channels to open. So anytime that you generate an action potential, that means you've generated a threshold stimulus, okay? And you'll see this a little bit more as we move forward. So here's my overview slide, and we have our action potential here with our threshold, which shows you what stimulus you've got to reach in order to generate an action potential. So if you were to isolate a neuron and then give it a stimulus, zap it with a probe, if you don't give it enough, the action potential, if you don't give it a threshold stimulus, nothing happens. So if let's just say that the threshold, you have to zap it at 3, okay? So with a power of 3, think about a microwave. So if I zap it with a 1 power, nothing happens. If I zap it with a 2 power, nothing happens. If I zap it with 3 power, we get an action potential, okay? So you've got to have that threshold stimulus for an action potential to occur. This also shows you your depolarization stage, repolarization, and hyperpolarization is also known as the refractory period. It allows the neuron kind of a break so that the action potential only goes in one direction. This refractory or hyperpolarization time won't allow the action potential to travel backwards down a neuron. Again, just to overview and put everything on one slide, you can see where at depolarization, your sodium channels open, okay? At the top, when you get to positive 30, your sodium channels will close and then more sodium will enter the cell. You'll see potassium channels, as it's becoming more and more positive, some of the potassium channels are going to start to open, okay? By the time you get to plus 30, all of the potassium channels will then open so that then potassium will leave the cell. So during depolarization, sodium is rushing in, and a little bit of potassium is rushing out, but more sodium is rushing in than potassium is rushing out. By the time you get to the positive 30 to 40 millivolts, the sodium channels stop, no more sodium comes in, your potassium channels are all open, potassium rushes out. They stay open a little bit too long, and you get that hyperpolarization. Now I've got an animation that I want you to watch, and then I will see you after that animation and talk about something else. So watch this animation, and I'll see you again soon.
Neurons send signals over long distances by generating and propagating action potentials. Most action potentials originate near the axon hillock of the cell body, in the initial segment of the axon. It then travels the entire length of the axon. A closer look reveals that during an action potential, voltage-gated channels open and close, altering the permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium ions. A threshold stimulus changes the shape of the voltage-gated sodium channels, causing their activation gates to open. This event marks the beginning of phase 1 of the action potential, known as depolarization. As sodium ions diffuse into the axon, the membrane potential becomes less negative. This causes more voltage-gated sodium channels to open, and the membrane potential soars to plus 30 millivolts. At this point, two key events occur. The inactivation gates of voltage-gated sodium channels close, and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events mark the beginning of phase 2 of the action potential, known as repolarization. As potassium ions diffuse out of the axon, the membrane potential becomes negative again. However, the membrane potential continues in the negative direction, going beyond the resting state of minus 70 millivolts. This marks the beginning of phase 3 of the action potential, known as hyperpolarization. During this phase, voltage-gated potassium channels close and all voltage-gated sodium channels are released from inactivation. By the end of this phase, ions move through leak channels only and the membrane potential returns to the resting state of minus 70 millivolts. The neuron is now ready to fire another action potential. Summary: generation of an action potential. A threshold stimulus opens voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium ions diffuse into the axon, depolarizing it to plus 30 millivolts. Voltage-gated sodium channels close, and voltage-gated potassium channels open. Potassium ions diffuse out of the axon, repolarizing it to a negative value. The membrane potential briefly hyperpolarizes. Voltage-gated potassium channels close, and the membrane returns to the resting state of minus 70 millivolts.
Okay, so you've just seen that short animation on generation of an action potential. And so the action potential is going to be generated at the axon hillock, or kind of toward the start of the axon. And this long tail is called the axon. And the action potential has to be kind of regenerated or propagated along the axon. It has to be moved along. And so this slide shows you, so if you had your voltage meter measuring it again, you would see that as the action potential moves along the axon, you just kind of get this flip-flop of charges all the way down the axon. So the action potential can just keep regenerating. So that's what these flip-flop of charges are showing you, so that you can see how the action potential is moving down the axon of the neuron. Now, a stagnant slide is really hard to explain that. It's kind of hard for that to make sense. So a better way is to see it moving and see it animated. So watch this next slide, and that'll help you understand what's going on as you move or propagate that action potential along the entire length of the axon.
Action potentials propagate in a continuous fashion in unmyelinated axons. Once an action potential is generated in the initial segment of the axon, it propagates the entire length of the axon. Recall that a threshold stimulus causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open. The influx of sodium ions generates an action potential. It also establishes a depolarizing current that flows to the next segment and brings it to threshold. Voltage-gated sodium channels open, regenerating the action potential in this segment of the axon. Current flows from this segment and depolarizes the next segment to threshold, thus regenerating the action potential yet again. In this way, regeneration continues in one direction all the way down to the axon terminals. The basis for unidirectional propagation is revealed when we take a closer look. By the end of the depolarization phase of the action potential, all voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events render this segment of the axon temporarily insensitive or refractory to another depolarizing stimulus. However, voltage-gated sodium channels in the downstream segment are closed and receptive to a depolarizing stimulus. Thus, propagation occurs sequentially down the axon to the axon terminals. In myelinated axons, action potential propagation is a bit different. Here they propagate in a saltatory or leaping fashion. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers of tightly wrapped glial cell membrane. But this sheath is not a continuous one. Exposed areas of axonal membrane, known as nodes of Ranvier, occur at discrete intervals. Voltage-gated sodium channels are abundant in the nodes, but largely absent between nodes. So, action potentials are regenerated at each node, not in areas covered by the myelin sheath. However, the myelin sheath does provide the insulation necessary for the rapid spread of depolarizing current. And the sooner the nodes reach threshold, the faster action potentials propagate along the axon. Saltatory conduction is extremely fast. Velocities often exceed 100 meters per second. In contrast, continuous conduction is fairly slow. Velocities rarely exceed 2 meters per second. Nevertheless, both continuous and saltatory conduction propagate action potentials over varying distances because action potentials regenerate along the way. Summary: propagation of an action potential. Once generated, the action potential propagates the entire length of the axon without decrement.
Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about today. I just put this slide in here to give you a place to see it all over again. Depolarization, where sodium enters a cell. Repolarization, where potassium is leaving. You may want to watch these two videos over and over again. You can see them in mastering if you go to my study area, my A&P Flicks. Those short videos can be found there. And there's more information in my study area too if you just need some more help on the action potential and how all that works. So call me, ask your instructor, or go to my study area and watch some of the extra videos that they have there to help you with these concepts. Again, this is a difficult concept, but you'll get it. So you may need to watch it several times, but you'll get it. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.